He currently leads as Director of Global Procurement and India Procurement Country Head at Caterpillar. Mr. Venkataramanan R. Dileep.
COVID actually showed us a different challenge, really, was when material availability became a lot challenging and you had to keep the shop floor and the factories running.
But that's an impressive scale, Mr. Dileep. 500 plus suppliers is no small feat. And it's really fascinating to hear how you balance speed, cost, compliance simultaneously.
One thing that as leaders you have to really understand is there's nothing called comfort zone anymore.
Hey everyone, welcome back to FaceTime with Leaders, powered by Directors Institute, World Council of Directors. I'm your host, Sunny Pancholi, and today we are diving into a world that keeps industries moving, quite literally. It's not just about machines, engines, or supply chains. It's about how decisions built on precision and purpose power the global economy. We are talking about engineering excellence, procurement strategy, and leadership that transforms challenges into global opportunities. And our guest today, he is someone who has lived that transformation from the shop floor to global boardrooms. Mr. Venkataramanan R. Dileep, a true powerhouse in global engineering and procurement, with over 27 years of experience across product development, strategic procurement, and organization transformation. He currently leads as Director of Global Procurement and India Procurement Country Head at Caterpillar, the world's leading manufacturer of construction and power equipment. Mr. Dileep has managed over $1 billion in global spend, guided teams across India, China, US, and Europe, and had led massive engineering and procurement transformations even during the pandemic. He has built centers of excellence, grown India's supply base, and driven innovation that keeps Caterpillar's global engines and global confidence running strong. Mr. Dileep, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to FaceTime with Leaders.
Good morning, Sunny. It's my pleasure to be here and thanks for having me.
Looking forward to a great conversation, Mr. Dileep.
Looking forward to it myself.
So, your career spans over 2 decades across engineering, procurement, and global operations, from launching next generation power solutions to leading billion-dollar procurement functions. But if you had to pick one or two defining moments, uh, perhaps a challenge that truly tested you or a decision that shaped your leadership journey, what would they be?
So again, that's an interesting question. If I look at my career over the last 27 years, there's been several defining moments. Okay, I think I've learned something new in everything that I've done, every job role that I have served. If I had to pick two of them, I'm going to pick one in my early career when I first became a leader. This was early 2009 in the midst of the great downturn. And I was given the leadership role and I actually had to lead a team of 5 people. The challenge really was because of the nature of what was going on. I had a team which was located in multiple locations. So I was based in Georgia. My team members were based in Illinois, Indiana, Northern Ireland, and Georgia. So it was the difficulty was here I am a first time leader and I don't have any of my team members in the same location as me. So what it made was really is to have clarity in the goals and also trying to really be very, very crystal clear about what the team wanted to do. So we were essentially working, this was I would say Teams or any of this era. So it had to be through teleconferences. So we were not able to look at each other, but we had to be talking to each other and really work through it. So I think that was a thing that really helped me to understand how leadership works, how can you work with different people in different regions, and also being very, very clear, articulate your what you want, and also being extremely, extremely pinpoint on what you wanted to do. I think that's why I call it the defining moment, because that was really I was thrown into the deep end and really asked to swim and survive. Okay. The the biggest defining moment, or I would say it's probably my the setting point, a highlight of my career was what I did at the beginning of the pandemic. Okay. I was essentially asked to set up a center of excellence for engineering for retail electric power, which is basically less than 1 megawatt. And as part of it, I had to come up with the strategy to form the team in India, to essentially recruit the right people in India, also talk about how do we do validation in India for the products. At the same time, I also had to come up with a strategy on downsizing my team, which I had in Northern Ireland, and also as part of it was also is the knowledge transfer. So this happened right through the mid of pandemic. So I had to work out the whole strategy. It was obviously because it impacted people, it was quite confidential. So I had to work through it, I had to think through it. How do you do it? And then we had the strategy work done probably the whole of 2020, and then 2021 and part of 2022 went into executing the strategy. So I think that's really where I learned how difficult or how challenging some of these transformations can be. How do you think about it? There are things that do go wrong which you don't anticipate, and you have to do course correction as you require. So I think this is where I would probably put as, at the end of the day, we were able to get this whole thing done in about a year's time, and then I left that role to a different role, my current role in 2023. And again, I would say 5 years later, the team is very well set and they are essentially executing very well. They're actually in the midst of almost every product development and activities going on globally. And they contribute almost to a 150 to $200 million of bottom line on an annual basis. So that's why I would say, looking at it and turning back at it, probably that defines what I have done so far.
So Dileep, those must have been high pressure moments, and I can really feel the
Absolutely.
stakes. It's incredible, and it's rare to hear someone navigate such complex challenges so thoughtfully.
No, it was challenging. It was definitely challenging, and I also had a lot of sleepless nights because it was whenever you talk about taking somebody's livelihood away or basically impacting jobs somewhere, it's definitely you have to think through it. It is always, you also put your personal side of things together. Yeah, at the end of the day, you had to do it because that's what the business wanted it, and that was the right thing for the business. But yeah, definitely, you have to balance out your personal versus the business requirements.
Absolutely, absolutely. So continuing our conversation, Mr. Dileep, you manage $1 billion across 500 plus suppliers for engine businesses. Post 2020, resilience became board level. So how do you decide where to dual source, where to hold inventory buffers, and where to localize and still protect COGS and working capital? Also, what I would like to ask you is, what guardrails and hard KPIs do you use to prove ROI on resilience?
So this is again, the COVID actually showed us a different challenge. Really, was when material availability became a lot challenging, and you had to keep the shop floor and the factories running, and we had to go and figure out different ways on how we can do it. So as part of it, we called it what was called as assurance of supply. So we were actually at that point of time, we were bulldozing through to the suppliers or looking for new suppliers wherever the material was, trying to buy as much as possible. So that was almost like, okay, do whatever is required, don't worry about it, get the material. That was the COVID. And then as we came out of COVID, obviously people started looking at, okay, how do we look so more region for region, looking at essentially resiliency and also as cost. So obviously, as we look into it, it's not always a straightforward answer. So when you look at cost reduction, which is one of the key drivers for localization, you're always looking at, okay, what is going to be my overall cost reduction? What's going to be my investment that I had to make for tooling or validation? And also what's going to be my overall total cost of basically savings. And then that's how you come back and look at it and say, okay, based on the ROI, you decide whether you want to localize that component for cost or not. And then you'll have to prioritize your components that you have, because that's how you basically make sure you're looking at the biggest buck for the bank. The other two things, resiliency is really where when you have very few suppliers or a single supplier supplying globally, and then you decide, okay, wait a minute, what happens if the supplier goes down or there's a challenge with the supply? And that's where you start working on a bunch of factors. We define it as a resiliency index, looking at type of ownership, what type of component is it, how easy is it to develop a component, that component if the supplier were to go down, and then based on it you come back and essentially run resiliency projects. And then that's where you decide, okay, I'm going to have a dual source or multi-source just to make sure that we have sources of supply. The third one is really, it's about really what we call it as assurance of supply, which is again very closely to resilience, is where whenever you have a problem basically with one supplier in a region or one supplier, then you want to make sure that if there's the suppliers on the fence, you start developing a alternate supplier. And that's what we typically do. And then overall, I would say over the last 2-3 years, that's been how we have been developing our strategy to develop new suppliers, looking at essentially whether it's a cost reduction driven or it's basically a resiliency driven, or essentially it's more of a, we want to have assurance that the next time something happens, we have a backup supply. And that's what we've been doing. And so definitely in terms of the KPIs that we use, typically it's an ROI. It's typically looking at a total cost of avoidance and basically total cost savings, and also looking at the overall resiliency index that we look at. How do we look into it? In India, there's also another challenge that we have lately, and this is because of the government having these quality control orders, which is basically prevents you from bringing in imported components. Again, there's been a QCO on some of the fasteners. There's also QCS going on other materials and things. So definitely that drives a localization effort, because otherwise you'll have to get the import suppliers to comply with BIS regulations and also get them BIS certification. So some of the suppliers don't want to do it. So that also drives some of the localization efforts in India. So that's typically how we manage it. And again, it's been overall, I think we have to look at the portfolio of projects that you have, prioritize them so that the most important ones are the ones that we do.
Absolutely, Mr. Dileep, and I can see why that required careful balancing. It's fascinating how you manage both resilience and cost. That's something every board would worry about.
No, in some cases, most cases, especially, yes, we look for cost reduction, but there are situations where, yes, we have to incur a cost increase, especially. And I think we have done that knowingly and intentionally. And then the other thing I will also add is what makes it sometimes more difficult is if the IP or the intellectual property is owned by the suppliers. That makes it extremely difficult. And you have to really, in that situation, what we look for is, can we have a very, very robust or a strong component purchase agreements or master purchase agreements with those suppliers, and also the inventory strategies and keeping sufficient buffer stocks so that if there's a challenge, we can overcome it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So talking about the growth in the India supply base, and you have driven both localization and exports, that is fabrication, tubes, gears, crankshafts, connecting rods, etc. What's your playbook for taking a part family from global dependency to a qualified India dual source or export hub, fast, compliant, and cost right?
No, I think like I said in the previous thing, Sunny, it's really we have to evaluate all of these things. Okay, so obviously some of these components require significant validation. So you have to make sure that you work very closely with the product teams, make sure that it is in their priority list. So that again, also this is where you evaluate your ROI in some cases. Okay, it's not just a cost reduction or cost driver. But if it takes, let's say, 6 months, a year, or longer to validate, then you have to factor that into picture and then work on it. And then also, just because you are in India doesn't mean you want to localize everything in India. You have to be very, very careful about which components, where it makes sense. In some cases, is it going to be a regional supply? So do we have suppliers in this region? In some cases, because of the complexity of the component or the complexity of the design involved, you may not even have a supplier in this region, and you're probably okay essentially using somebody outside India for that. And so it's, again, that's what we look into it. And then as we work with the suppliers, you want to make sure that we are very clear about what we want to do in terms of the functional requirements. You have to basically work very closely with them, understand their process, understand their capabilities, and we'll have to work with suppliers. I would say we are lucky if we find some supplier who's a plug and play, but in most cases we'll have to work with them, develop them to our requirements to make sure that they meet what you want, and then So it's always going to be a back and forth process. Sometimes, yes, the first samples don't succeed, then you'll have to go back and work with it, then go back and then essentially understand where you went wrong, try to come back, redo it again, take the engineering team with you, take essentially the assembly, because sometimes the assembly guys will come back and say, no, we have some challenges. So we'll have to make sure that all of those things are taken care of as you work with this.
But that's an impressive scale, Mr. Dileep. 500 plus suppliers is no small feat. And it's really fascinating to hear how you balance speed, cost, compliance simultaneously.
No, definitely. It's always a question about, we call it essentially quality, velocity, and cost. So obviously, quality and safety are not something that we compromise, but then we'll have to then come back and have the trade-offs in terms of your velocity and cost.
Great. So you have led both engineering, P&L, and procurement. Give us one instance where design choices, standardization, VAVE, DFM, DFA, unlocked the more value than classic price negotiation. And how did you align quality, regulatory, warranty risk, and kilowatt per dollar targets?
So I'll give it a very good example, Sunny. This goes back to what we did in India locally. Okay, this was years ago when I had engineering responsibility. CPCB2 emissions was coming on board, and we had a challenge because obviously all the gensets that we sold in India below 800 kVA had to undergo the change. Because it was regulations and emissions that was driving it. But at the same point, we also had the cost was going to go up significantly because of the emissions technology that we had to put the after treatment and things that we had to put on the engines. So, which meant that we had to take a significant amount of cost out of the packaging, which was basically your enclosures, base frames, cooling systems, etc. So, what we did in this case was we really said, okay, we set out with a cost target that we established for us to be competitive in the marketplace. And then once we had that cost target, we identified a supplier early enough in the game and said, okay, we need to go and work with the supplier and understand the overall design as well as the cost impact. So what we did is, I'll take the enclosure as an example. We went to the enclosure supplier. We said, okay, we have this cost target. How do we meet it? We also used some simulation before we went to the supplier to optimize the design, okay, where we could reduce the footprint so we can actually reduce some of the cost and things. And then we worked with the supplier and said, okay, let's look at each feature by feature, and essentially decided to optimize even the overall size of the enclosure so that we don't waste any material as we convert. Then we looked at each feature, how it's supposed to be formed, what it is, their processes. And so at the end of the day, what we did was we actually had an overall feature by feature cost analysis that we had done at a joint workshop with the supplier. So once we had it done, that's what we converted into the prototype design, and then we validated it. And then also it helped us because we understood the cost impact, and so we were able to take certain things out. And that's how I would say we not only met the quality and essentially the overall requirement, but we actually also met the cost targets. Okay, so we did the same thing with the cooling supplier. We did the same thing with our controls supplier. So this is something that we had to do very, very closely, work with the supplier, I would say. And again, you could call it VAV, you could call it CPPD, but this was all basically what it meant was we started with a blank sheet of paper. And so by the time we were done, we actually knew what we were getting. So that's something that I would say is an example. And I would say is we pretty much used this approach across several other projects, actually, whether it was for India or globally. And that's really where we were able to achieve some significant cost and quality targets to be able to meet, even on global programs.
That's a remarkable way to create value, Mr. Dileep, and it's impressive how you balance design improvements with compliance and warranty risk.
No, we have to do it because the market is getting very, very competitive, and if you're and this is where you have to be really careful. You have to be intentional about what you do.
Absolutely, Mr. Dileep. All right, so moving forward, the dashboards can rest, the spreadsheets can breathe because it's time for our rapid fire round. So, no overthinking, no engineering diagram, just first instinctive answers. So, are you up for it?
Yep, I'm up for it. Let's see.
Okay. So, here goes the first question. What's your absolute comfort food when you are traveling abroad?
So it's nachos and salsa for me. Okay.
Okay, great. If your life were a movie, what would the title be?
It's resiliency because that's what I have been through my career.
Great. Which song instantly turns your day around no matter where you are?
Ruk jana nahi.
Ah, lovely, classic. If you could host a dinner with any three people, dead or alive, who would you invite?
So I'm gonna it's gonna be an interesting one because when I look at it, there are three people that I admire. One is Steve Jobs for what he created. I think he's one of the people I really look up to. The other one is Prime Minister Modi because he's somebody that I actually the way he has transformed the country. I think I definitely have a lot of regard from. And the third one is Rahul Dravid. Okay.
Rahul Dravid, the ball.
Yep.
Are you a cricket fan?
I am a big cricket fan.
Okay, great. All right, we have to move forward because this is a rapid fire round. So, what's
Yep.
the strangest or most unexpected thing you have ever tried and actually liked?
I don't know really because when I look into it, I would say probably once I went for a whitewater rafting. I think that was the thing that I'm not a big adventure when it comes to sports and things, but I think that's something I did once, and I think that was something I liked.
Nice. If you suddenly had a superpower for one day, what would you do with it?
I always think strive to be a better person myself. So I think if I had a superpower, it's okay. And how can I be a better person? That's all I would use it for.
Incredible. A movie line or quote that has stayed with you for years.
This is something I keep telling myself and my team. This is a famous quote by General Patton. It is about a good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week. Because sometimes we all wait for perfections, we think, but no, somebody else will eat your meal and go away. And I think that's why it's important that you have a good enough plan that you can execute.
That's inspiring. And finally, the last question. If your life had a tagline, what would it be?
Keep marching.
Great. So let me tell you, Mr. Dilip, this rapid fire round was fun, fast, and quick, and good to know the personal side behind the profession.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Dilip, when you look at some of these moments, whether it's global supply chain disruptions, compliance lapses, or governance breakdowns, what stands out to you as the real lesson for today's leaders?
So I think one thing that I would say as I look through back at my career, the early days, things were a lot more predictable, a lot more stable. Your business cycles used to be a lot longer. You can plan for things, you can plan for the next downturn, you can plan for the next upturn. But as we have seen 2008, I think through the first big challenge to a lot of people, which they didn't understand what was going on. And then the cycle started getting a lot more shorter. And then we had the COVID situation in 2020, and then the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Red Sea disruptions, then also you have the whole thing with now with the tariff situation. So one of the things that it's done for us as leaders really is you have to be really thinking and you have to think quickly. I would say this is a perfect situation where I would say it's VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So it's all of them thrown at you all the time right now. There's nothing, and again, so things change very rapidly, and you have to be able to decide and move. Otherwise, you're going to be left behind. So I think that's one thing that you have to be really is expect the unexpected right now. That's how it is. And then if something changes, you have to be able to act on it. The other thing really is there's nothing called a perfect decision anymore. I think you have to use the facts and data that you have and be able to decide and move on. And so the one thing that it does put a lot of challenge on us is, are you being compliant? Are you really meeting all the regulatory requirements? I think that's something that goes without a say. We have to, in spite of all those things here, just to make sure that all of those things are not overlooked. So I think from a leadership standpoint, Sunny, the way I look at it is really is today's leaders have to be really nimble. They have to be able to act fast. they have to be able to understand things quickly and also take the teams along and explain to them why they are doing.
Absolutely, Mr. Dilip, and that's a remarkable example. You know, the states really put leadership to the test, and it's interesting how a single incident can reveal so much about governance and organizational culture.
Absolutely, because I think that's where it's important, because a lot of people will say, I'm going to take a shortcut. It's not about taking the shortcut, it's about doing the right things in a smarter manner.
Absolutely, absolutely, no doubt about it. All right, so that brings us to the last part of this podcast. And since you have recently been associated with Directors Institute, and that's always interesting to our listeners, so let me ask you, what inspired you to join Directors Institute in the first place? And how
So,
is the experience you're thinking about leadership and decision making at the executive level?
so Sunny, I think one of the things I've been thinking about really is what's next for me. Okay. And I think as I look at it and say, okay, I have a wealth of experience spanning the last 27 years. And so this is where I started thinking, okay, how can I contribute more to the industry and the businesses in India? And this is where I started looking at what can be done. And as part of my research, I came across Directors Institute. I also knew a few people that had done courses from Directors Institute and who came back and said that your programs actually help them out. And that's really where I started exploring it and said, okay, right now, this is where it is. So I've actually signed up with your independent directors program. So that's something that I hope to finish in the next few months. And then once I'm done with it, that gives me the ability to actually help other companies, other industries, basically from what I know and how I can contribute more. That's the reason why I've signed up for Directors Institute. And the experience has been good so far.
It's great to hear how the Institute shaped your perspective, and it's interesting how those sessions translated into real world boardroom decisions.
Definitely. No, it's again, I think that's what I'm hoping to learn from here. And I think I can obviously help translate that into helping the industry.
Rightly said. So let me tell you, Mr. Dilip, what a conversation this has been, you know, from building resilient global supply chains to reimagining engineering excellence. You have shown us that leadership is equal parts clarity, courage, and conscience.
Definitely. Yep.
And what really stood out today is your belief that transformation succeeds not through system but through trust, and that ethics isn't an add-on; it's the backbone. Right. So
Absolutely.
thank you so much for sharing your experiences, lessons, and reflections with us on FaceTime with Leaders, powered by Directors Institute, World Council of Directors.
No, thank you, Sunny, for having me. And again, it was a pleasure talking to you today. Again, thank you.
Thank you once again, Mr. Dileep. And I'm your host, Sunny Pancholi, and to everyone listening, thank you for joining us. Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and as I always say, lead with integrity. Thank you and have a nice time.
Thank you. Bye.